Full disclosure, Imran Khan has been a personal friend of mine for more than 20 years. I was never, nonetheless, his party man, travelling as I did for 30 years with the late Benazir Bhutto. But I have always loved and admired him, not least his stance against war, against imperial domination, which is, of course, the reason he's now behind bars and the reason he was deposed in a US-backed military-executed coup d'etat which removed the most popular Pakistani leader by a country mile and then began the witch hunt of his supporters and his party men, his members of the National Assembly, members of the Provincial Assembly, the wives and daughters and sisters and mothers of Imran Khan's friends have been ruthlessly witch hunted, imprisoned, beaten and starved. Some of them have been disappeared only to turn up as corpses in foreign lands. It is not just a crime against Imran Khan and his good wife now, who joins him behind bars today, but a crime against democracy in Pakistan. And that's something I've always been in favour of. As many of you know, I hold the two highest civil awards in Pakistan, the Halal-e-Quaid-e-Azam and the Halal-e-Pakistan, the first for my contribution to the restoration of democracy in Pakistan in the 1970s and 80s, and the second for my work for the freedom and self-determination of the people of Kashmir. Those two highest civil awards were given to me because of my love of democracy in Pakistan, and I will never relinquish that love. And that places me this evening as Imran Khan's party man, albeit my long history with the People's Party of Pakistan, because all of the other parties have conspired with the United States and the military top brass to try and murder democracy, to try and kill Imran Khan's political career. But as I said in the introduction, there are astonishing signs, unless they rig the actual count, also that Imran Khan's party, whose emblem has been taken off the ballot paper and whose candidates were subjected to brutal repression to try and get them not to place their names on the ballot paper in the first place, may yet triumph in the upcoming Pakistan parliamentary elections early next month. We'll keep you abreast of that. The biggest story, of course, remains the war, famine, pestilence and disease, which is still rampaging, the four horsemen of the apocalypse through the Palestinian territory of Gaza, but also increasingly in the shape of hundreds of dead people since October 7th, the Palestinian West Bank, which is ruled by the political opponents of Hamas, just in case you're one of the remaining fools who think this conflict began on October 7th and that this conflict is about Hamas. Let me start with something that happened in the West Bank city of Jenin this very week. Like a Mafia hit job, Israeli special forces, dressed as Arabs and dressed as medical personnel, white coats, stethoscopes, wheelchairs, and fake babies in carry cots included, entered a hospital in Jenin and shot to death a quadriplegic patient who had been in hospital for months and two others at his bedside, in a hospital, dressed as doctors and dressed as Palestinian Arabs. It is something that the Mafia, like the Godfather movies, could easily have presented as fiction. This was fact. Now, you'll recall that the Palestinians were accused of using hospitals as a base for the resistance, which then justified the destruction and partial destruction of every single hospital in the Gaza Strip. What then is people posing as doctors and murdering patients in their beds, but an act of international terrorism. I have no qualm at all about declaring Israel a gangster terrorist state, and they proved it all over again with their terrorist attack on a quadriplegic patient, shooting him to death. I could talk about the little girl, Hind, still missing after being trapped in a car whilst all of her family were murdered in that car. The little girl of 4 or 5 years old, the only survivor. But has she survived? The Palestine Red Crescent Society is still searching for her. The car in which she was traveling with her mother, her father, her sisters, the car is still there in full view in Gaza, in a street filled with Israeli tanks. And Israel will not habeas corpus, will not produce the little girl Hind. I could talk about dozens and dozens and hundreds of atrocities that are taking place right now across the Palestinian territories. But I'd rather talk about the atrocities we ourselves are committing here in Britain, there in the United States, and in a small but influential group of countries, almost all of them European colonialist countries. The savage decision to withdraw funding from the UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, in the 24-hour period after the decision of the International Court of Justice in The Hague, about which I spoke on Sunday, has gathered pace since Sunday. Like an episode of Strictly Come Dancing, perfectly choreographed, the Israelis, the Israeli media, that trustworthy organ, the Israeli press, released an allegation only, without evidence, that 12 members of the 13,000 members of UNRWA staff in Gaza had been involved in the operation on October 7th. Without waiting for UNRWA's investigation, without asking for a single scintilla of evidence, in a 2.5-hour period, virtually all of these Western countries cut off all the aid to the UNRWA, and not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in the refugee camps in Jordan, and elsewhere. This was, as I said on Sunday, the equivalent of pulling the complete funding of the National Health Service because Dr. Harold Shipman, a general practitioner in the NHS, had been found to be a murderer. No one would countenance such an act. But this act was very obviously decided upon in order to divert attention from the guilty verdict in The Hague. And it worked perfectly. Suddenly, it was as if the verdict of the ICJ, 15-1, 16-2, judges, overwhelming, landslide majority in the court, as if it never happened. In fact, the Western allies of Israel have doubled down on their support for the genocide in Gaza, having effectively left themselves open to prosecution if they continued to support a plausible finding by the court of genocide, a decision of the court to give Israel 1 month to cease and desist those practices which plausibly constituted genocide. We have now added to our collaboration in this great crime, the crime of pulling the funding on which the entire Palestinian refugee population entirely depends. Not just for food, but for medicine, but for school, and all the other services that the UNRWA provided. And thus we have made ourselves doubly culpable in an act of genocide. And almost in every case, with government and opposition in the Western countries concerned, in lockstep. A merger. There is a cross-party merger when it comes to the killing of Palestinians. In the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans rejected the ICJ finding of genocide and backed the complete cutting of the UNRWA funding. In the United Kingdom, exactly the same. But they did not count on one thing, that eventually the last straw breaks the camel's back. And there are real signs that that has begun to happen. Just in the last few days, in the last few hours, there is a revolt going on in Britain. Yes, centered on heavily Muslim-populated cities. In London, in the northwest of England, in parts of Yorkshire, a revolt, an uprising is going on. A peaceful uprising is going on. As people say, this far, no further. Up with this, we will not put. You have to change your tune now, or you can forget about us ever voting for you again. And I'm a witness to that in real time. I have come to the studio this evening from Rochdale, where there's a parliamentary by-election on the 29th of February, where Labour, which completely rules and dominates the town and has dirtied the town clock in so many ways over so many years, is now in a situation of electoral, political paralysis and fear, unable to go out, unable to canvass, for people slamming the door in their face and videotaping themselves doing so through their doorbell cameras. People saying that Labour should get off the Rochdale streets. People in Croydon, in London, cancelling campaign launches. People like David Lammy unable to go to scheduled events because of this uprising amongst people who've had enough of the sickening spectacle of massacre and genocide. Genocide is not an ordinary word. It's not an ordinary thing. It is beyond massacre. It is beyond war. It is the attempt literally to wipe out, to annihilate, to extirpate an entire population. And thanks to these, everyone has watched it happening in real time. It doesn't matter that it wasn't on the TV. It doesn't matter that it isn't in the newspapers, because fewer and fewer people expect the truth from the TV or from the newspapers. More and more people, and the younger they are, the more likely they are to get their news in real time on their telephone, on social media, and everyone has seen the slaughtered children. Everyone has seen the cesarean sections performed on women without anesthetic. They saw a baby born today from a dead mother by cesarean section. They've seen the dogs and the cats eating the corpses of Palestinian bodies that cannot be recovered from the rubble. Everyone has seen it. And surprise, surprise, the politicians who have supported it have suddenly woken up to the fact that many of their voters are disgusted, repulsed by it, and are no longer prepared to vote for the people who have facilitated the genocide. That's the truth of it. Now, if you want my honest opinion, you know my view of the lesser of two evils. I don't believe that Joe Biden was the lesser of two evils. And I certainly don't believe that Sir Keir Starmer, the so-called leader of the so-called Labour Party, is the lesser of two evils between him and the inky-fingered clerk of empire, Rishi Sunak. Keir Starmer's the more evil of the two, because as Malcolm told us more than 50 years ago, almost 60 years ago. The wolf, we know what the wolf intends, but the fox looks like he's smiling as he comes towards you with exactly the same intent. Wolf in sheep's clothing. That's Keir Starmer. A wolf in sheep's clothing who's supposed to be a Queen's counsel, a King's counsel, a human rights lawyer who declared on national radio that Israel had the right to cut off the water and the electricity from 2.3 million people in Gaza, who refused to call for a ceasefire, who repeatedly stated that a ceasefire would benefit only Hamas, and he dragooned most of his members of parliament, most of his candidates. Check their Twitter feeds if you don't believe me into supporting him. 50 Labour MPs did call for an immediate ceasefire, and fair play to them. 7 of them had to resign from the Labour front bench in order to do so, because they would otherwise have been sacked. Nothing can change these facts. No amount of polling or initiatives or soft soap can change these facts that Labour, Lammy, Starmer, Nandy, and the other gang of cutthroats at the head of the British Labour Party have facilitated this catastrophe and even supported the cut to the grant to UNRWA at the risk of starving 2.3 million people to death. Collective punishment, so brazen, so obvious that you wouldn't need to be a King's Counsel successfully to prosecute it in court. So I'm here to tell you that the Labour Party is crumbling in front of our eyes, and their members, their activists, their representatives know it. So look out for people jumping ship over these next days and weeks. Look out for a refinement of the language here and there. And don't forget the guilt of this so-called Labour Party in this great crime against the people of Palestine. It's going to be the mother of all talk shows, so I suggest you fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night, not least because the one and the only Scott Ritter is up right after this.